Hi, my name is Karen Jeffrey and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk you through some research that I've been doing that looks at how individuals' policy preferences respond as they feel increasingly vulnerable to a potential labour market shock caused by automation, and how exposure to specific types of rhetoric mediate that response. And I investigate that using a survey experiment. So to be clear before I get started, when I'm talking about automation, I'm talking about using machines or software or algorithms to perform any task that would previously have been carried out by a human worker. So the motivation for this study comes from the emergent evidence that suggests although we're seeing a great deal of growth in automation, we haven't really seen much of an impact in terms of overall employment levels as a result. But what we have seen is that automation has increased inequality between different types of workers, as well as between workers and technology owners. And in response to that, some high-profile politicians have come out and advocated for redistributive policies that are designed to decouple growth in automation from growth in inequality. So Andrew Yang, of course, has called for what is essentially a universal basic income, and Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the UK Labour Party, or the former leader of the UK Labour Party, has called for a policy that would enable workers to reduce their working hours by 20% without having their wages reduced at all, as a response to the impacts of automation on labour markets. The question that I'm interested in is, as workers are increasingly exposed to automation, will they get behind these types of redistributive policies? So to situate this within the related literature, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the canonical models of preference formation that assume that voters will support redistribution as long as it's in their economic interests to do so. But of course, in the past 2 or 3 decades, we've seen a large literature emerge that paints a much more complex picture of preference formation. And one strand of that literature identifies this really interesting interaction between exposure to a labour market shock and exposure to politicised rhetoric that seems to be causing voters to update their political and policy preferences in a way that's not well aligned with their economic interests. So concretely, what these studies have been finding is that workers who are exposed to job insecurity or who have lost their jobs become much more responsive to rhetoric that speaks to their concerns about job loss or about unemployment, and promises to protect jobs and protect access to scarce welfare resources. And of course, the rhetoric that has done that in a very powerful way has been the rhetoric employed by the radical right that says it will achieve those goals by restricting immigration or by restricting international trade. And indeed, when we look at the emergent literature on how workers who've been most exposed to automation to date, how their political preferences have responded, what we're seeing is those workers are tending to become more supportive of far-right parties and far-right policies. So the theory that I want to test in this study is that there may also be other types of rhetoric that are really prevalent that could be influencing policy preferences in another way, and that is by suppressing support for redistributive policies, even when workers are facing potential job insecurity. So this is rhetoric that resonates with vulnerable workers. And there are 2 types of rhetoric that I think are really important. So the first is the narrative or persuasive communication is commonly featured in the press that states that taxing wealth creators threatens jobs. So we see headlines warning about capital flight or about job losses anytime there's a suggestion that we might increase the top rate of income tax or might increase corporation tax. And that is something that might resonate a lot with a worker who's already facing job insecurity and cause them to potentially even oppose redistribution if they think it will make their job insecurity worse. The second rhetoric that I think is really important is very common in the UK especially, is stigmatization of welfare claimants. So this painting a picture of welfare claimants as being undeserving and dishonest, and that I think could also resonate with workers who are facing job loss or who are seeing others being faced with job loss, by making them less inclined to support redistributive policies. So the first hypothesis that I test is that informing individuals about their potential vulnerability to an automation shock will either suppress or decrease their preferences for redistributive policies. And of course, this is contradicting what those canonical models assumed. And then the second hypothesis is that politicized rhetoric, which is designed to challenge those existing narratives, could in fact increase preferences for redistributive policies. I also conduct a little bit of further analysis where I test for heterogeneity in the response and preferences across different education levels. And this is really important and a key contribution of the study because to date, more educated workers have tended to be relatively immune and shielded from any of the negative labour market effects of automation. However, going forward, as technological advances enable more and more complex tasks to be capable of being automated, then we're expecting to see more educated workers starting to be negatively affected by automation. So it's really important that we understand how those more educated workers' preferences respond. However, the studies that have been carried out to date have tended to be observational studies, and because these more educated workers haven't yet been affected, they haven't been able to detect how their preferences are responding. So I test these hypotheses using a survey experiment. I worked with the survey company Prolific to recruit a sample of 2,500 adults resident in the UK. And the survey took about 4 minutes to complete. And the final sample, I waited to make it as close to being representative of the UK population as possible. And I also used some techniques to ensure that the demographic composition of each of the treatment groups was very well balanced, so that I wasn't getting any interference with my results as a result of unbalanced treatment groups. So the survey experiment consists of 4 key elements. First, respondents were asked some demographic questions. They were then randomly assigned to one of 3 treatment groups before being asked about policy preferences and some questions about their expectations about the likely impacts of artificial intelligence and automation on the labour market for society as well as for them personally, and some other questions about their beliefs. And the idea was to see how exposure to the different treatments influence policy preferences. So the automation shock treatment, it begins by saying 1 in 3 UK jobs are expected to be lost to automation in the next 10 to 15 years. This could lead to lower wages, it could lead to more unemployment, and it emphasised that highly educated workers as well as less educated workers are at risk. So it included a statement talking about how accountants and some legal and medical specialists have already started to be negatively affected by automation. The automation shock with rhetoric treatment is next, and it includes all the same information as the automation shock treatment. So again, trying to convince people that they may be vulnerable to an automation shock in future, no matter how educated they are. But it also includes some rhetoric, which is designed to try and challenge the prevalent narratives that I think might be suppressing support for redistributive policies. So the rhetoric starts off by saying, some say that if corporations replace employees with machines, billionaire bosses and shareholders will profit while ordinary workers lose their jobs. So the idea here is to divert attention away from the idea that taxing wealth creators threatens jobs, and instead to really emphasize that, these billionaire bosses and shareholders are going to benefit at the expense of ordinary workers. And there I'm trying to appeal to respondents' sense that, gosh, this would really be unfair if automation were to increase inequality, which has been shown to be quite a powerful motivator of preferences for redistribution. The treatment then is trying to tackle the stigmatization of welfare claimants by presenting a more positive and more universal vision of welfare. So it says, but if we find a way to share the wealth that's created, we could all work less and spend more time doing the things we enjoy. And then the final group receives a placebo treatment, which is similar in style and length to the other two treatments, but it's designed to have no effect on the policy preferences under consideration. So onto the results, and before looking at the main results, I first wanted to check whether the treatments achieved what they had been designed to do, first and foremost, which was to make respondents feel concerned or to perceive themselves as being vulnerable to an automation shock. So I measure perceived vulnerability by asking, to what extent do you disagree or agree it is likely that you or a member of your family will lose your job to automation within the next 10 to 15 years. And the results that are shown here, so the pink shows the effect of the automation shock treatment, and the blue shows the effect of the automation shock with rhetoric treatment. And what you can see is both treatments increased agreement with that statement relative to the baseline. So by about just over 5 percentage points in the case of the automation shock treatment, and just over 10 percentage points in the case of the automation shock with rhetoric treatment. So this is good news. It means that the treatments achieved what they were intended to do, which was to make people feel more concerned that they might be negatively affected by automation in the future. Now, looking at the main results, so the pink here is showing first the effect of the automation shock treatment on policy preferences. And I tested for 7 different redistributive policies. And then in the bottom row there, I also include a test on preferences for restricting immigration, just because so much of the existing literature finds the effect of exposure to automation in terms of increasing support for nationalist policies and nationalist political parties. And looking at the top 2 lines, what we see is that the automation shock treatment, despite making people perceive themselves to be more vulnerable to potential job loss or negative consequences resulting from automation, we see a decline in support for the top 2 redistributive policies, and then no significant effect on preferences for the remaining redistributive policies, with one really interesting exception, and that is the policy of reducing working time without reducing wages, and there we see a significant increase in support. Now, I think one reason that might have occurred is because that is the only policy of all those tested that offers a potential to protect against growth in unemployment by sharing out the work that remains after automation, as well as redistributing. And then looking at the effect on preferences for restricting immigration, we see there is no significant effect, which at first seems to contradict the existing literature. However, I found that when I disaggregate that result by income level, respondents in the bottom half of the income distribution actually did significantly increase their support for restricting immigration, whereas the top half didn't. And that is matches up pretty well with what the existing studies show, because of course they've only been able to assess the effect on workers who've been exposed to automation to date, who have tended to be in the lower half of the income distribution. So looking next at the effect of adding in the rhetoric, so the automation shock with rhetoric treatment, what we see in the top 2 rows is that it prevents that decline in support for those redistributive policies. And then for all the other redistributive policies, with the exception of providing a universal basic income, we see that adding in the rhetoric increases support significantly for those policies. And again, on restricting immigration, there's no effect, and even when I disaggregate it, there's no effect. So in summary, I take this as showing that as workers perceive themselves to be more vulnerable to automation, their preferences for redistributive policies either decline or remain constant, but using rhetoric that challenges some of the existing narratives that may be suppressing support for redistribution does either prevents the decline or increases support for redistributive policies. And finally, I look at the heterogeneous effects across education levels. So again, the pink points are showing the effect of the automation shock treatment. And we see this really interesting C shape across education levels, whereby the most and least educated respondents increased their support for redistributive policies, whereas the middle to education groups either didn't increase or reduced their preferences for redistributive policies. But you can see in the blue, which shows the effect of the automation shock with rhetoric treatments, adding in that rhetoric had very little effect on the most and least educated respondents' preferences, but increased preferences for redistributive policies of the middle to education categories, significantly so. And I think what's really interesting here is that individuals educated to bachelor's degree level, the coefficient there switches from being negative in response to the automation shock to being positive in response to the shock with rhetoric. So just to conclude, I find that increasing respondents' perceived vulnerability to an automation shock leads to constant or reduced preferences for redistributive policies, with the exception of reducing working time. But adding in rhetoric that challenges some of the existing narratives increases preferences for several of the redistributive policies, and these effects are particularly pronounced amongst respondents who have a bachelor's degree. So I think this makes several interesting contributions. The first is it provides some future-oriented insight. So if we expect more educated workers to increasingly be negatively affected by automation going forward, what these results suggest is that we might actually see more resistance to redistribution as those workers are increasingly affected. It also underscores the crucial role played by rhetoric in shaping preferences. So there's another experimental study that looks at how policy preferences respond to increased exposure to automation. And it finds the threat of automation has no effect and does not change policy preferences. But what I would say is this study suggests we need to take a broader perspective on that and think not only about the labour market effects, but also exposure, how that might be interacting with exposure to rhetoric. And then also the policy level analysis, as opposed to purely looking at voting preferences, reveals some really interesting variation. In particular, it seems to be suggesting that voters prefer policies that would protect against job loss over policies that would strengthen the social safety net. And just very briefly, of course, there are some limitations to this study. Further research would be needed to test the persistence of the effects in the presence of competing rhetoric, as well as endurance of the effects over time. Okay, so thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing your feedback.